Hey there, folks. Welcome back to Succinct Psychology, aka Succinct. My name is Jaia Hendrickson, and today I'm going to be starting out Chapter 12 in Principles of Social Psychology. And again, I want to reiterate, as always, these slides have been pulled from the University of Minnesota libraries, and they have been edited for presentational purposes. Chapter 7 is going to revolve around stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And some of the topics we're going to be examining more closely are going to be social categorization and stereotyping, in-group favoritism and prejudice, and then finally, reducing discrimination. Modern increases in globalization and immigration are leading to more culturally diverse populations in the United States and across the globe. People from minority groups now account for over one-third of the US population, as well as most of the growth in the labor force. Older people are working longer, women are becoming more equally represented in a wide variety of jobs, and the ethnic mix of most corporations or occupations is also increasing. These changes will create many benefits for society and for the individuals within it. Gender, cultural, and ethnic diversity can improve creativity and group performance, facilitate new ways of looking at problems, and allow multiple viewpoints on decisions. On the other hand, as we've seen in many places throughout these chapters, perceived similarity is an extremely important determinant of liking. Members of culturally diverse groups may be less attracted to each other than are members of more homogeneous groups. They may have more difficulty communicating with each other, and in some cases, they may actively dislike and even engage in aggressive behavior toward each other. The principles of social psychology, including the ABCs, so affect, behavior, and cognition, apply to the study of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And social psychologists have expended substantial research efforts to study these concepts. The cognitive component in our perceptions of group members is known as stereotype. And the stereotype is the positive or negative beliefs that we hold about the characteristics of social groups. We may decide that Italians are romantic, that old people are boring, or that all college professors are nerds. And we may use those beliefs to guide our actions toward people from those groups. In addition to our stereotypes, we may also develop prejudice, which are an unjustifiable negative attitude toward an outgroup or toward the members of that outgroup. Prejudice can take the form of disliking, anger, fear, disgust, discomfort, and even hatred. And our stereotypes and our prejudices are problematic because they create discrimination, which is unjustified negative behaviors toward members of outgroups based on their group membership. So we see here on the slide, we have affect representing prejudice and in-group favoritism, then we have behavior representing discrimination, and then we have cognition representing stereotyping. So you see how the ABCs, affect, behavior, and cognition perfectly apply to examining prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. Thinking about others in terms of their group memberships is known as social categorization, which is the natural cognitive process by which we place individuals into social groups. Social categorization occurs when we think of someone as a man rather than a woman, as a person that's old rather than young, or as a black person rather than an Asian or a white person. Just as we categorize objects into different types, we also categorize people according to their social group memberships. And once we do so, we begin to respond to those people more as members of a social group than as individuals. Imagine for a moment that two college students, John and Sarah, are talking at a table in a student union at your college or your university. At this point, we would probably not consider them as acting as group members, but rather as two individuals. John is expressing his opinions, and Sarah's expressing hers. Imagine, however, that As the conversation continues, Sarah brings up an assignment that she's completing for her women's studies course. It turns out that John doesn't think there should be a women's studies program at the college, and he tells Sarah this. He argues that if there's a women's studies college at the women's studies program at the college, then there should also be a men's studies program as well. Furthermore, he argues that women are getting too many breaks in job hiring and that qualified men are targets of discrimination. Sarah, on the other hand, feels quite the contrary. She argues that women have been targets of sexism for many, many years, and even now they don't have the same access to high paying jobs that men do. You can see that an interaction that began at an individual level, as two individuals just having a conversation, is now turned to the group level, in which John has now begun to consider himself a man, and Sarah's now begun to consider himself as a woman. In short, Sarah's now arguing her points not so much for herself, but as a representative of one of her in-groups, namely women. And John is now acting as a representative of one of his groups, namely men. Sarah feels that her positions are correct, and she believes that they're true not only for her, but for women in general. And the same is true for John. You can see that these social categorizations may create some potential for misperception, and perhaps even hostility. John and Sarah may even change their opinions about each other, forgetting that they really like each other as individuals because they're now responding more as group members with opposing views. We tend to see people who belong to the same social group as more similar than they actually are. And we tend to judge people from different social groups as more different than they actually are. The tendency to see members of social groups as similar to each other is particularly strong for members of outgroups. And this results in outgroup homogeneity, which is the tendency to view members of outgroups as more similar to each other than we see members of in-groups. I'm sure you've had this experience yourself. When you find yourself thinking or saying, "Oh, they're all the same. They're all alike." Outgroup homogeneity occurs in part because we don't have as much contact with outgroup members as we do with in-group members. And the quality of the interaction with those outgroup members is often superficial. This prevents us from really learning about the outgroup members as individuals. And as a result, we tend to be unaware of the differences among the group members. In addition to learning less about them because we see and interact with them less, we routinely categorize outgroup members and therefore make them appear more cognitively similar. Our stereotypes and prejudices are learned through many different processes. The multiplicity of causes is unfortunate because it makes stereotypes and prejudices even more likely to form and even harder to change. For one, we learn our stereotypes in part through our communications with our parents and peers, and from the behaviors we see portrayed on the media. Even a 5-year-old child who has learned cultural norms about the appropriate activities and behaviors of boys and girls has also developed stereotypes about age, race, and physical attractiveness. And there's often good agreement that stereotypes of social categories among individuals about within a given culture. Once they become established, stereotypes, like any other cognitive representation, tend to persevere. We begin to respond to members of stereotype categories as if we already knew what they were like. Yakov Trope and Eric Thompson in 1997 found that individuals addressed fewer questions to members of categories about which they had strong stereotypes, as if they had already knew what these people were like, and that the questions they did ask were likely to confirm the stereotypes that they already had. In other cases, stereotypes are maintained because information that confirms our stereotypes is better remembered than information that disconfirms them. When we see members of social groups perform behaviors, we tend to better remember the information that confirms our stereotypes than the information that disconfirms our stereotypes. If we believe that women are bad drivers and we see a woman driving poorly, then we tend to remember it. But when we see a woman who drives particularly well, we tend to forget that. This is, of course, another example of the general principle of assimilation. we tend to perceive the world in ways that make it fit with our existing beliefs more easily, then we change our beliefs to fit the reality around us. Because stereotypes and prejudice often operate out of our awareness, and also because people are frequently unwilling to admit that they hold them, social psychologists have developed measures for assessing them indirectly. One difficulty in measuring stereotypes and prejudice is that people may not tell the truth about their beliefs. Most people don't want to admit, either to themselves or to others, that they hold stereotypes or that they're prejudiced towards some social groups. To get around this problem, social psychologists make use of a number of techniques that help them measure these beliefs more subtly and indirectly. One indirect approach to assessing prejudice is called the Bogus pipeline procedure. In this procedure, the experimenter first convinces the participant that he or she has access to their true beliefs. For instance, by getting access to a questionnaire that they completed in a prior experimental session. Once the participants are convinced that the researcher is able to assess their true attitudes, it's expected that they'll be more honest in answering the rest of the questions they're asked because they want to be sure that the researcher doesn't catch them lying. The bogus pipeline procedure suggests that people may frequently mask their negative beliefs in public. People express more prejudice when they're in the bogus pipeline than they do when they're asked the same questions directly. Because our stereotypes are activated spontaneously when we think about members of different social groups, it's possible to use reaction time measures to assess this activation and thus to learn about people's stereotypes and prejudices. In these procedures, participants are asked to make a series of judgments about pictures or descriptions of social groups and then to answer questions as quickly as they can, but without making mistakes. The speed of these responses is used to determine an individual's stereotypes or prejudices. The most popular reaction implicit measure of prejudice, the implicit association test, is frequently used to assess stereotypes and prejudice. In the implicit association test, participants are asked to classify stimuli that they view on a computer screen into one of two categories by pressing one of two computer keys, one with their left hand and one with their right hand. Furthermore, the categories are arranged such that the responses to be answered with the left and the right buttons either fit with or match the stereotype or don't fit with, i.e. mismatch the stereotype. It's easier because the stereotypes are matched or associated with the pictures in a way that makes sense. When the responses are arranged on the screen in a matching way, such that the male category and the strong category are on the same side of the screen. So for example, on the right side, participants can do the task very quickly and they make very few mistakes. Since they're on the matching side of the stereotype, it just makes it easier for them. But when the images are arranged such that the women in the strong categories are on the same side, whereas the men in the weak categories are on the other side, most participants make more errors and respond more slowly. The basic assumption is that if two concepts are associated or linked, they'll be responded to more quickly if they're classified using the same rather than different keys. So we see here on the slide, this is just a visual representation of the implicit association test. So you sit at the computer screen, and on one side of the screen you have white or bad, black or good, and then you see a picture of, say, a black person or a white person pop up, and you have to click the corresponding. So if it's a black person, you click black, or a white person, you click white. Attempting to prevent our stereotypes from coloring our reactions to others takes effort. We experience more negative affect, particularly anxiety, when we're with members of other groups than we do with people from our own groups. And we need to use more cognitive resources to control our behavior because of our anxiety about revealing our stereotypes or our prejudices. When we know that we need to control our expectations so that we don't unintentionally stereotype the other person, we may try to do so, but doing so takes effort and we may frequently fail at this. Stereotypes and prejudice have a pervasive and often pernicious influence on our responses to others, and also in some cases on our own behavior. To take one example, social psychological research has found that our stereotypes may, in some cases, lead to stereotype threat, which is performance decrements that are caused by the knowledge of cultural stereotypes. Spencer, Steele, and Quinn in 1999 found that when women were reminded of the untrue stereotype that women were poor at math, they performed more poorly on math tests than when they were not reminded of the stereotype. And other research has found stereotype threat in many other domains as well. Research has found that stereotype threat is caused by both cognitive and affective factors. On the cognitive side, individuals who are experiencing stereotype threat show an impairment in cognitive processing that's caused by increased vigilance toward the environment and attempts to suppress their stereotypical thoughts. On the affective side, stereotype threat creates stress as well as a variety of affective responses, including anxiety. Stereotype threat is not, however, absolute. We can't get past it if we try. What's important is to reduce the self-concern that's engaged when we consider the relevant negative stereotypes. More important, manipulations that affirm positive characteristics about oneself or one's group are successful at reducing stereotype threat. In fact, just knowing that stereotype threat exists and may influence our performance can help alleviate its negative impact. Alright folks, this is going to conclude my first video covering Chapter 12 in Principles of Social Psychology, looking at stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. I hope you guys found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next video.